I am Bryce of the Cinder Archive, and this is Chapter 13, The Clerk Who Knew Too Much. A redaction has a shape, even once the ink is gone. Wick proved that much in the archive, tracing a scraped rectangle back to a bevel only a handful of hands in the city know how to cut, and one of those hands, he was fairly certain, answered directly to the Gearwright Hallmaster. Certainty is not the same as a name, though, and a technique is not the same as a person willing to admit they used it. The party has spent 3 days since turning that certainty into something more solid. Quiet questions asked of quiet people, a modest bribe here, a called-in favor there, and has arrived, finally at an address on the city's outer edge, and a decision about what to do with it. Trails, unlike walls, can be walked to the end of, if you're willing to knock on a stranger's door and ask him to give up something he clearly hoped he'd buried along with his career. The cottage sits at the edge of aetherglen's outermost ring, past where the brass and siphon skyline gives way to kitchen gardens and low stone walls and the particular quiet of a neighborhood that exists specifically for people who have finished being important. The road out here runs past increasingly modest holdings, the city's industrial hum fading by degrees into birdsong and the distant complaint of someone's goat, until even Orsa, walking it, allows something in her shoulders to loosen that has stayed tight since the archive. It is small, tidy, whitewashed recently enough that the whitewash still looks proud of itself, fronted by a garden worked with more care than strict necessity requires, rows of beans climbing worn stakes, herbs in raised beds, a stand of late-season marigolds gone slightly leggy in a way that suggests their keeper loves them more than he prunes them. A low iron gate, more decorative than functional, separates the garden from the lane, and it creaks faintly when Brahm pushes it open. Elias Marrow, Wick says, low, checking the name against the address he'd extracted from Mott 3 days after their archive visit. Once a modest bribe, and a not unkind reminder of professional courtesy had loosened the archivist's memory of who'd retired out of the Hallmaster's clerking staff, and when. 40 years in the Hallmaster's office. Near enough. Retired 8 years back. No scandal on record, just age, and a pension, and apparently a great deal of enthusiasm for marigolds. You're certain this is the same clerk, Senna says, certain enough to knock. Bot didn't have a name for the redaction itself. Nobody keeps a ledger of their own crimes, funnily enough, but he had a name for every clerk trusted with the Hallmaster's seals over the last 2 decades, and there are only 3, and one of them died 6 years ago, and the other's still actively serving and would have noticed us asking. That leaves Morrow. Wit's mouth curves, faint and without its usual full confidence. It's a guess dressed up as certainty. I'd rather be honest about that before we knock. Orsa studies the tidy rows of beans, the whitewashed walls, the general, careful peace of the place, with an expression that isn't quite suspicion and isn't quite sympathy either. Whoever lives here wanted very badly to stop being noticed, she says. Look how hard he's worked at it. That's not a man hiding something shameful. That's a man hiding from something that frightened him. Those are always different things, Brahm says, quiet, and steps up to the gate himself. Birdsong fills the pause after the gate's creak. Some small garden bird, indifferent to the 5 strangers now standing in its territory. And somewhere behind the cottage, a chicken complains about something, with real conviction. Brahm knocks. Twice, plain and unhurried, the knock of a man who has knocked on a great many doors in his life and has never once found benefit in disguising the fact that he's there. The door opens on a narrow chain first, then fully, once its owner has had a look at who's come calling. Elias Marrow is somewhere past 60, spare and stooped, wearing a gardener's canvas apron over clothes that still, somehow, carry the ghost of a clerk's careful pressing. His eyes move across the 5 of them with the fast, assessing precision of a man who spent 40 years reading people's intentions off their posture before they'd said a word. And whatever he reads in this particular group makes something in his face close, quietly and completely, like a shutter coming down. I don't take whole visitors anymore, he says, before anyone has said anything at all. Whatever you're here about, I retired 8 years ago. I'm not the man to ask. We only need a few minutes of your time, sir, Senna says gently, the practiced diplomacy of an ashen vow paladin who has knocked on plenty of doors that didn't want to open for her. We're not here on hall business exactly. I know exactly whose business you're here on, Marrow says, and there's real fear under the flatness of it, quick and immediately regretted, as though the words got away from him before he could stop them. "I don't discuss old hall matters with strangers. I'm sorry. Good day." The door doesn't slam. It closes, carefully, with the particular controlled firmness of a man who has spent a lifetime being polite, even while being afraid, and the chain slides back into place behind it with a small, final click. Nobody moves for a moment. Orsa looks at Wick, one eyebrow raised, half a question. Wick shrugs, unbothered, already glancing back toward the lane. Well, that confirms he's the right clerk at least. A man with nothing to hide doesn't know whose business he's guessing at before we said a name. "We're not pushing our way in," Senna says, firm. Nobody suggested it. Bram is still looking at the closed door, arms folded, something working behind his eyes that isn't quite a plan yet. Give him a few minutes. Let him watch us not leave. Sometimes that tells a frightened man more than anything you could say to him directly. They don't leave. They settle instead along the low stone wall bordering the lane, unhurried, making no particular effort to look threatening or urgent. Orsa examining the marigolds with real, unforced interest, crouching to inspect a stem gone slightly to seed with the practiced eye of someone who has kept her own gardens in better soil than this. Wick idly tossing a coin. He's clearly done this with 100 times before. The small, repetitive motion of a man perfectly comfortable waiting out someone else's nerve. Tamsin quiet, watching shuddered when Tats shudder heart with the enemy that has gwen. "He'll come round," Orsa says, not looking up from the marigolds. Anyone who tends a garden this carefully isn't a man built for holding a door shut against people who mean him no harm. It costs something, keeping a stranger locked out. Most people run out of the will for it faster than they expect. "You sound certain," Senna says. "I've watched a great many frightened animals decide eventually that stillness is safer than flight. People aren't so different when it comes to it." Orsa straightens, brushing soil from her fingers, and settles against the wall to wait with the rest of them. It's perhaps 20 minutes before the door opens again, just a crack, Marrow's face appearing in the gap with the specific expression of a man who has spent that 20 minutes arguing with himself and lost. "You're not here to arrest anyone," he says. Not quite a question. "No, sir," Bram says, before anyone else can answer, and steps forward alone, slow and unhurried, hands visible and open at his sides, the whole unmistakable body language of a man announcing, without needing words for it, that he intends no harm and has all the patience in the world. We're not hall enforcement, not Crown either. We're private contract working a mission that's led us, by a long and mostly unwanted road, to your door. I won't pretend that's not unsettling, a group of strangers turning up asking after old business. I'd be unsettled too, in your position." Marrow studies him for a long moment. Bram's plain, unadorned bulk, the ironbreaker crest worn without ostentation at his collar, the specific stillness of a man who has clearly done a great deal of standing quietly in dangerous rooms, and has never once needed to perform calm because he simply has it. "Ironbreaker," Marrow says, reading the crest. "Bram Cold Iron. Was Crown adjacent muster before that, some years back. Retired out of it myself. Same as you retired out of your own work. I understand a little of what it is to want to be left alone with a garden after a life spent minding other people's business." Something in Marrow's face shifts, just slightly, not trust yet, but the specific, cautious softening of a man who's just been spoken to as an equal rather than a target. "You don't look like Hall Muscle," he says. "I'm not here as Muscle. I'm here because a friend asked 5 strangers to trust him with something, and he hasn't earned quite enough of that trust yet to make us stop asking questions on his behalf." Bram's voice stays level, unhurried, no charm in it the way Wick would spend charm, no urgency in it, the way Senna might reach for urgency. Just plain, patient honesty, offered without expectation of anything in return. "I won't lie to you and tell you this is nothing. It clearly isn't, or you wouldn't have looked the way you looked when you opened that door the first time. But nobody here means you harm, and nobody here is going to make you say anything you don't choose to say. I'd just ask you to consider that whatever you've been carrying alone for 8 years might weigh less, shared with people who aren't asking out of malice." Marrow's eyes narrow slightly. Not with suspicion, exactly. More the sharp, appraising look of a man who spent 40 years learning to read exactly how much weight sat behind a person's words. "You've carried something yourself," he says. It isn't quite a question. That's not a stranger's guess you just made. That's experience talking. Something like that, Bram says, and doesn't elaborate, and Marrow, perhaps recognizing in the non-answer a kindred instinct toward privacy, doesn't press him on it. The chicken, somewhere behind the cottage, complains again. Marrow looks at Bram for a long moment, then past him, at the other four waiting patiently along the wall, making no move to crowd the doorway, and something in the sum of it, the stillness, the patience, the plain absence of threat, seems to settle a decision in him that fear alone couldn't reach. "Tea," he says finally, gruffly, opening the door the rest of the way. "I've kettle water already hot. I'm not saying I'll tell you anything worth the walk out here, but I'm not leaving a man who talks like that standing in my lane either." The cottage's front room is small, plain, scrupulously tidy in the way of a man who has organized his whole remaining life around the things he can still control. A modest hearth holds a kettle just beginning to sing, the sound of it oddly, briefly, calling to mind an entirely different kettle in an entirely different chapter, though none of the party currently standing in this room has any way of knowing that particular resonance. Marrow moves through the ritual of tea-making with the careful, unhurried precision of a man for whom small rituals have become load-bearing cups set exactly, leaves measured exactly, a small chipped pot warmed first with a splash of hot water before the actual brewing begins, the whole small ceremony a kind of armor against whatever conversation is coming. Wick, watching from the bench, leans slightly towards Senna. "I'd a whole approach ready for this," he murmurs. "Rye, pitched low enough not to carry. 3 different angles, depending on how he opened the door, didn't get to use a single one." Bram simply asked him honestly, Senna says, not unkindly. "I noticed. It's mildly humbling, is what it is." Wick's mouth twitches, something between amusement and genuine unshowy respect. "Took me 11 years to learn how to talk my way into rooms like this." Took him one sentence about a garden. He pours for Bram first, then, after a moment's visible consideration, for the rest of them in turn, and settles into a worn chair across from where Bram has taken the room's other seat, leaving the younger members of the party to find perches on a narrow bench along the wall. 41 years, Marrow says, without being asked, staring into his own cup rather than at any of them. 41 years in that office. I started as a boy barely older than some of you look now, running messages between departments, learning which senior clerk took his tea with honey, and which one would have your head for interrupting him before noon, the small, useless-seeming knowledge that somehow becomes the whole shape of a career if you let it. I worked my way up to where a hallmaster trusts you with his own seal, which is not a small thing to be trusted with, whatever you might think of clerks generally. His hands, wrapped around the cup, show the faintest tremor. Not age alone, Bram suspects, watching closely, but something closer to old, familiar fear resurfacing. I did a great many things in that office I was proud of, records preserved, disputes settled fairly. A whole career's worth of small, careful honesty put toward keeping this city's paperwork trustworthy, because paperwork is trust in the end, whatever anyone tells you about handshakes and honor. People trust the hall because they trust its records. And the redaction, Bram says gently, not pushing, simply naming the thing they both already know is coming. Marrow's hands tighten slightly around the cup. "One thing," he says, "quiet, in 41 years. One thing I did that wasn't honest, and I've had 8 years in this garden to decide whether I regret it, and I still haven't landed anywhere solid." He looks up, finally, meeting Bram's eyes rather than the tea. "You already know it was me. I could see it on your friend's face in the archive. Whoever told him, Mott, I'd guess, the old fool never could keep a still tongue about who trained under whom. So I won't waste your time pretending otherwise. Yes, I scraped that name. My own hand, my own technique, taught to me by a mentor 30 years dead who'd be appalled to know what I finally used it for." "Why teach a technique like that at all?" Orsa asks, "if it's only ever meant for hiding things?" Marrow considers the question longer than its bluntness perhaps deserves. It was meant only for that, in fairness. Records get damaged, honestly. Sometimes, water, fire, and ink spill nobody caught in time, and the clean, careful repair keeps a whole ledger from looking suspect over one accidental blot. That's what I was taught it for, preservation, not erasure. I told myself doing it that I was simply preserving something the Hallmaster had decided needed a cleaner history than the one it actually had. His mouth twists, something bitter and self-aware in it. It's a comfortable lie if you tell it to yourself carefully enough. I told it to myself for the better part of 8 years before I stopped quite believing it. Why? Senna asks, quiet, from the bench. Because I was ordered to. Mara's voice doesn't rise, but something in it hardens, the old practiced discipline of a man who spent decades following instructions precisely. Hallmaster Bellamy called me into his private office himself, not a note, not a junior relaying instructions, the man himself, which alone told me how much it mattered to him. I remember the room exactly. Late in the evening, most of the staff gone home, just the 2 lamps he kept lit for himself and a fire he hadn't bothered building up properly, like he'd been sitting in the cold rather than call an apprentice to tend it. He had the patent record already pulled, already flagged, sitting on his desk between us like something he didn't want to touch more than necessary. He told me a name needed to disappear from it, cleanly, permanently, in a way that wouldn't read as damned if anyone ever looked closely. He told me it was for Sterling's own protection. He says the phrase carefully, precisely, the exact words apparently preserved whole in memory across 8 years. The way a man preserves the exact wording of an order he's spent a long time trying to decide whether he agrees with. Not an order I questioned aloud. You don't question the Hallmaster's private office, not when you've spent 40 years earning the trust to be let inside it. But I've questioned it plenty since. Sitting out here with my beans, wondering whether protection was really the whole truth of it, or just the part of the truth I was allowed to be told. Did he seem frightened? Tamsin asks quietly from the bench. Bellamy. When he gave the order. Marrow considers this with more care than the question first seems to warrant. Not frightened, he says finally. Grieved, maybe? There's a difference in my experience between a man protecting himself and a man protecting someone else out of something closer to guilt. He didn't look like a man covering his own tracks. He looked like a man doing something he felt he owed someone, and didn't enjoy owing it. You said he didn't build up the fire, Tamsin presses gently, that he was sitting in the cold. Do you think that meant something, or is it only a detail you happen to remember? Marrow is quiet a moment, turning the memory over with the same careful attention he's given every question tonight. I've wondered about that more than I probably should have over the years. A hallmaster doesn't sit cold in his own office by accident. There's always an apprentice near enough to tend a fire, day or night, if he wants one tended. I've come to think he wanted the discomfort. Some men do that when they're about to do something they're ashamed of. Deny themselves a small comfort as a kind of penance in advance, as though the cold might count for something against whatever they're about to authorize. He shrugs a small tired gesture. It's a clerk's habit, reading meaning into details like that. I can't promise you it means what I think it means. I only know I've never forgotten it in 8 years of trying. Protection from what? Wick asks. I don't know. Mara's honesty here carries a different weight than his earlier stonewalling, the specific, unburdened honesty of a man finally allowed to admit the limits of his own knowledge. I was told what to scrape, not why. That's the nature of an order like that. You're trusted with the doing of it precisely because you won't be told enough to make trouble with it afterward. I assumed at the time some ordinary scandal. A partnership gone sour, a business dispute the hall wanted quietly buried, before it embarrassed its favorite genius. I didn't think then that it was anything larger than that. I'm considerably less certain now, given the sort of people who've apparently come asking about it since. The kettle's steam has thinned to almost nothing by the time Marrow continues, unprompted, his gaze drifting toward the room's small window and the garden beyond it rather than toward any of them directly. The specific, softened focus of a man remembering something he hasn't let himself remember properly in a long while. The project itself shut down not long after, he says, abruptly. No public announcement, no formal hall notice, just gone, one season to the next, the way a candle goes out rather than the way a fire's properly extinguished. I never knew the details, above my clearance, whatever it actually was. But I knew Sterling himself, a little, the way clerks know the artificers whose paperwork crosses their desks for years running, and I can tell you plainly, he was different afterward. Quieter. For a time? Not broken, exactly. Nothing so dramatic as that, nothing you'd have noticed unless you already knew what Loud looked like on him. He pauses, turning his cup slowly in his hands, choosing the next words with the care of a man who wants to get an old memory exactly right rather than merely close. I used to see him some mornings, crossing the hall's main floor toward whatever he was working on that season, and he'd nod at the clerks the way he always had, polite, quick, never quite present enough to remember our names, which none of us minded, given who he was. For a stretch of months after that meeting in Bellamy's office, the nod stopped coming. He'd walk past with his eyes somewhere else entirely, like a man reading a letter only he could see. I remember thinking, at the time, it was grief of some kind, though I couldn't have told you grief for what. How long did it last? Senna asks gently. A season, perhaps two. I didn't count closely. You don't, when it's someone else's sorrow and not your business to track it. But it didn't last, mind you. Within a year or two, he was back to his old self, charming half the hall, building whatever caught his fancy next. He shakes his head slowly, an old sadness surfacing that has nothing performative in it at all. I remember thinking, at the time, that whatever quiet had come over him must have healed clean, the way a bad break sometimes does if you're lucky. I've wondered since whether it healed at all, or simply learned to hide better than it used to. Tamsin on the bench goes very still. Do you know where it happened? Bram asks, quiet. The project. Where it was actually done. Mara was silent for a moment. Some old, careful instinct visibly weighing whether this, too, crosses a line he shouldn't cross. Then, slowly, he rises, crosses to a small writing desk in the corner, another relic of the clerk's careful habits, everything in its place, a blotter and a neat row of pens and a single unlit lamp arranged with the same precision as the tea things, and returns with a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil, and sketches, with the quick, precise hand of a man who spent a career drawing exact things, a rough map, a lane, a landmark or two, a district on the city's northern edge marked with a small de Licourt. Aldergate, he says, setting the sketch on the low table between them. Out past the old cistern works, where the hall used to keep annex workshops for projects it didn't want. Under the main roof's daily traffic. The building's likely derelict now. I've no reason to think anyone's maintained it, given how thoroughly the hall wanted the whole matter forgotten. But that's where the project was housed. So far as my own paperwork ever told me, I never went myself. I only ever handled what crossed my desk after the fact. He taps the X once, as if to underline his own uncertainty. It's not much of a map. I was never there in person, only ever routing correspondence and supply requisitions addressed to it. But the district's right, and the lane off the old cistern road is right. Someone who knew where to look could find the building itself easily enough from there. What kind of requisitions? Bram asks. If you handled the paperwork, even at a distance, you'd have seen something of what the project needed. Marrow considers this, his old clerk's memory visibly working to separate what he actually knew from what he's only ever assumed since. Materials, mostly. Fine-gauge brass, in quantities well past what a single workshop ought to need for anything ordinary. Specialized glass, the kind used for pressure viewing ports rather than windows. Once or twice, requisitions for materials I didn't recognize at all, routed through a supplier I'd never heard of before or since. I remember thinking, at the time, that whatever Sterling was building out there, it wasn't built from a single hall's usual catalog. He shakes his head. I filed it all without asking, the way a good clerk does. It's only in hindsight, knowing what came after, that any of it looks like anything more than an ambitious man's expensive habits. Tamsin leans forward slightly, looking at the sketch, and something crosses her face that has nothing to do with the map's simple lines and everything to do with the district's name. Aldergate, she repeats, quiet. You know it? Senna asks, watching her. The Bloodless Squire keeps old bloodline records out that way, Tamsin says slowly, working the thought out loud as she has it, her eyes still on the pencil-sketched X. Family lineage archives, older ones that predate the hall's current registry system. There's an old annex building past the cistern road itself, half a mile at most from wherever this is. I've never had reason to go, myself. It's not somewhere current initiates get sent, it's mostly kept for scholars doing lineage research, the kind of work nobody young is usually assigned. She traces the rough lane on Marrow's sketch with one finger, not quite touching the paper, the same careful half-distance she's kept from every piece of Gearwright adjacent evidence since the archive. I couldn't tell you why that should matter. It's probably nothing. Aldergate isn't a large district. It would hardly be strange for two old archives to end up housed near each other, if land was cheap out that way, and nobody much wanted the neighbors. She doesn't say anything more than that. Doesn't voice whatever else the coincidence has stirred in her, but her fingers have gone tight where they rest against her knee, and Senna, watching, files the reaction away without pressing it, the way she's learned to file most of Tamsin's small, unexplained moments, these past several chapters. Orsa, too, glances toward Tamsin once, a brief, assessing look that asks a question she doesn't voice aloud either, and lets it go when Tamsin's expression offers nothing further to read. Marrow watches this exchange without understanding its full weight, though something in his old clerk's instincts seems to register that it means more to the room than the map itself does. I couldn't tell you why that would matter, he says, careful. I only know where the project was housed. Whatever else is out that way, that's not knowledge I ever had cause to hold. You've told us more than we came expecting, Brahms says, and there's real gratitude in it, plain and unadorned. I know it cost you something. It did. Marrow looks down at his own hands, still faintly trembling around a cup gone cold. I've carried that redaction 8 years without saying it aloud to a living soul. There's a strange relief in finally setting it down, even to strangers. Maybe especially to strangers. You're not going to look at me any differently tomorrow, whatever I've just told you, and there's a comfort in that I hadn't expected to find. He looks up, finally, something almost pleading in it. I'd ask you not to use my name if it comes to that. Whatever this actually is, I did wrong, I know it, I've known it for 8 years. But I did it because I was ordered to, and I've paid for it every day since, in ways I don't imagine any of you would think to ask about. I'd rather not pay further. We won't use your name, Senna says gently, and means it. They leave a little after that, Marrow walking them as far as his own gate, with the loose, unburdened posture of a man who has set down a weight he'd stopped believing he'd ever be allowed to set down. He lingers there a moment, one hand on the gate's iron frame, watching them go with an expression that's harder to name than relief alone, something closer to a man who has finally said a true thing aloud and is still deciding how it sits with him. Thank you, Bram says simply, pausing at the gate himself. I know what it cost you, saying it plainly, instead of letting it stay a secret you carried alone. Most men would rather keep the comfortable lie than trade it for a harder truth, even 8 years on. Most men haven't had 8 years of marigolds to think about it in, Marrow says, and there's the ghost of real humor in it, tired but genuine. I'm not sure I'd have said any of it to a hall inspector, or a crown officer, or anyone with the standing to make my confession into a formal problem. You didn't come here with that kind of standing. You came here as people who needed to understand something, not people who needed me punished for it. That's a rarer visitor than you'd think in my experience. I hope whatever you're chasing is worth what it's already cost, he adds, as Brahm turns to go. And I hope, whatever it turns out to be, that it doesn't cost that boy any more than it already has. Whatever he did to earn Bellamy's protection, I never once believed, in 41 years of reading men's faces for a living, that Sterling was the sort who meant real harm to anyone. Careless with himself, maybe, never cruel. We don't think so either, Senna says, and means it, and the low iron gate creaks close behind them one final time as they start back down the lane toward the city proper. They don't get far. Geary's proxy automaton is waiting for them at the lane's turning, a foot-tall brass figure standing with an urgency that reads wrong on its small, familiar frame, before any of them fully register why. The proxies have always carried some faint echo of Geary's charm, even at their smallest, most mechanical scale, a certain tilt to the head, a certain warmth in the projected voice, the sense, however small the frame, of a man genuinely glad to see you. This one has none of that left in it at all. It stands too still, angled slightly wrong, like something urgent has been poured into a vessel never quite built to hold urgency. You went to Marrow's cottage. Geary's projected voice, small and tinny through the proxy's frame, carries none of its usual charm, no joke reaching to soften the edges, no warm deflection. Just something close to real fear, thin and sharp, and underneath it, unmistakably, the sound of a man who has been standing somewhere, waiting for exactly this conversation to become necessary, and has not slept well in the waiting. I heard you'd gone asking about the old workshop. Please, I need you to stop. Whatever you think you're chasing, whatever you found, it isn't worth what you're about to walk into. We already have found something, Geary, Senna says, careful, watching the small figure's flickering urgency with real concern of her own. We know about the redaction. We know Bellamy ordered it. We know there was a project, and that it ended badly enough to change you for a while, and that its old workshop still stands out past Aldergate. The proxy goes very still for a moment. A specific, mechanical stillness that carries somehow all the weight of a man on the other end of it going pale. Then you know enough to know it's not something you should go looking at with your own eyes, Geary says, and his voice has gone sharper now, stripped almost entirely of its usual warmth, something closer to genuine cornered fear than any of them have heard from him since the mission began. I'm not asking this time as your employer. I'm asking as someone who's already lost more to that place than any of you understand yet, and I don't want to watch it cost anyone else anything at all. Please, leave it alone, let it stay buried. What's out there, Gary? Wick asks, direct, no charm of his own spend trying to soften it. Plainly, not the version you'd give a stranger, the version you give someone you actually trusted. There's a long pause before the answer comes, the proxy's small light flickering once, as though whatever's transmitting through it is struggling with the shape of its own honesty. I can't, Geary says, finally quiet. Not yet. I know how that sounds, coming from me, after everything I've already asked you to take on faith. I'm not asking you to trust that there's nothing there. I'm asking you to trust that whatever's there is mine to carry, and that carrying it alongside me won't make it lighter. It'll just mean more people hurt by the same thing. You're not telling us to stop, Bram observes, quiet, watching the proxy with the same steady attention he gave Marrow an hour ago. You're asking. There's a difference, and I think you know it. The proxy is silent for a long moment, the small brass figure's urgency guttering, briefly, into something that might, on a face capable of showing it, have looked like defeat. I am asking, Geary says finally quiet. I don't have the standing left to do anything but ask. I never did, not really, not with any of you. I only ever had whatever trust you were willing to lend me, and I think we all know by now how much of that's left. A pause, small and raw. Please anyway. Ask isn't nothing. Nobody answers him immediately. The five of them stand a moment in the lane's afternoon quiet, bird song drifting faintly from Marrow's garden behind them. The small, urgent proxy waiting for an answer. None of them are quite ready to give lightly. Tamsin's eyes drift, briefly, toward the northern edge of the sky, toward wherever Aldergate sits beyond the rooftops, and something in her expression, for just a moment, looks less like resolve and more like a private, unspoken dread she hasn't found words for yet. It's Senna, finally, who speaks for all of them, gentle but entirely unmoved from the course they've already, silently agreed on among themselves. We hear you, she says. We're going anyway. Not because we don't care what it costs you to ask. Because we've come too far now not to see what you've spent 8 years protecting us from finding. The proxy doesn't argue further. It simply stands there a moment longer, small and brass and uncharacteristically without a single charming thing left to say, before its light dims and the connection closes, leaving the party alone in the lane with a hand-drawn map, a clerk's carried secret, and a district called Aldergate waiting for them at the edge of the city. Above them, the afternoon has gone quietly, unremarkably gray, the particular flat light of a day deciding whether to rain, and none of them move for a moment longer than the silence strictly requires. 5 people standing in a stranger's lane, holding between them the first real fear any of them has heard from the man who hired them, and choosing, together, without needing to say so aloud again, to walk toward it anyway,